Gnome for Christmas, a coffee break cozy mystery. By Celia Kinsey. You are listening to an AI-narrated audio story. If you'd rather read this little mystery, there is a link to purchase an ebook copy in the description. 2 days before Christmas, 1952. I was in the kitchen admonishing Flora to scrub harder at the remnants of the breakfast eggs stuck to my best skillet, and putting the finishing touches on the fruitcake I was about to slide into the oven when I heard the ruckus upstairs. Our employer, Mrs. Bamberger, often raised her voice, but generally not so much so that the sound traveled distinctly down the stairs and along the corridor to the kitchen. That morning, however, I could distinguish actual words. Judging by the fragments of Mrs. Bamberger's diatribe filtering down the hall, she was angry about something having been broken, but I couldn't imagine who she was angry with. Generally, it's Flora who breaks things. I decided it must be Mrs. Bamberger's grandson Herbert, home from college for the Christmas holiday, who'd smashed one or another of the expensive knickknacks Mrs. Bamberger kept around the house in profusion. Herbert's parents were on the SS Atlantic, halfway between New York and Europe, whooping it up while their son was stuck with his grandmother for what was supposed to be the happiest season of all. I felt sorry for the boy, even if he was a bit of a wastrel. Herbert's activities consisted entirely of eating at all hours of the day and night, reading spy novels, playing solitaire on the floor under the table in the dining room, and getting tipsy on the cooking sherry, which was the only alcohol Mrs. Bamberger allowed in the house. Then I overheard Mrs. Bamberger invoke the name of Fergal, and I decided that it was likely not Herbert who was getting the earwigging of a lifetime. "I'd better go see to what's troubling Mrs. Bamberger," I told Flora. She rolled her eyes. Flora was even more peeved with our employer than usual. Earlier that morning, Mrs. Bamberger had looked out an upper-story window and caught Flora kissing her boyfriend, who also happened to be the milkman, under a sprig of mistletoe at the side door where the tradesman made deliveries. This wanton display of affection had so offended Mrs. Bamberger that she'd thrown up the sash and emptied the entire contents of her old-fashioned wash basin onto their heads. Flora had dodged into the doorway and escaped the deluge, but poor Ricky, the milkman, had been forced to continue his rounds soaked to the skin from the waist up. Flora hadn't even dared to bring Ricky in and dry him off. Flora was far from the first to run afoul of Mrs. Bamberger for one reason or another. Reverend Foster, who visited our widowed employer faithfully every Thursday afternoon and listened to her wax eloquent about what was wrong with this modern generation for 3/4 of an hour before he excused himself to make his other calls on the sick and the needy, was perhaps the only one in town who'd yet to be the object of Mrs. Bamberger's wrath, and even that seemed nothing short of miraculous. Surprisingly, Mrs. Bamberger had too great a respect for men of the cloth to remark, until after he'd departed anyway, on how the Reverend invariably forgot to wipe his boots before walking on the good carpet in what she insisted on referring to as the parlor. For his part, Reverend Foster was far too dependent on his wealthiest parishioners' sizable donations to the church maintenance fund to point out that Mrs. Bamberger was a cantankerous old biddy that nobody liked. I followed the sound of Mrs. Bamberger's voice to the front sitting room. "I know you smashed Fergal to pieces and concealed the remains," Mrs. Bamberger was saying when I entered. "How dare you lie to me?" Anthony, the gardener, was standing just off the edge of the carpet, nervously twisting his cap in his hands and trying not to drop leaf mold onto the polished oak floor. Fergal, in case you were feeling concerned for his bodily safety, was not human. He wasn't even canine. Fergal was a garish plaster-of-Paris garden gnome. You'd never have known that by the concern Mrs. Bamberger was expressing over Fergal's welfare, however. I believe she'd have been scarcely more upset if Anthony had run over Herbert with the lawnmower and subsequently presented her with a basket of the assorted bits and pieces of what was left of her grandson. "What's all this about?" I asked. Anthony turned to look at me, a pleading expression on his face. Anthony is a nice young man with a nice young wife and 6 hungry little mouths to feed. I did not want to see him suddenly jobless 2 days before Christmas, and I very much feared that Mrs. Bamberger's next move would be to issue Anthony his walking papers. "What is it, Ruth?" Mrs. Bamberger demanded, as if I had not myself already asked her a question. "What's happened to your garden gnome?" I asked. "He broke it," said Mrs. Bamberger, wagging her finger at Anthony. "Did you see him break it?" I asked. I didn't need to. I know it was him. How do you know it was him? If I'd been younger or shorter in Mrs. Bamberger's employ, I couldn't have gotten away with asking such impertinent questions. It wasn't that I'd never been chastised by the old lady. I had been scolded on numerous occasions. It was just that I knew it would take a lot more than a few pointedly worded questions about the fate of a plaster of Paris garden gnome to get me fired. I'd been an indispensable fixture in the Bamberger household for 20 years, dating back to when there was still a Mr. Bamberger, and the Bamberger daughters were still living at home. Cordelia Bamberger would have had to have lost her mind in order to fire me over a little impertinence, and she might be cantankerous, but she was not crazy. Anthony, on the other hand, was not in such a position of privilege as I. He'd only been the gardener for 6 months, and he wasn't even a very good one. He knew how to take care of plants well enough, but he was so absent-minded he nearly always forgot all the fastidious little instructions Mrs. Bamberger was so fond of handing out, and he was constantly misplacing his tools. By way of example, the previous day I'd found a shovel leaning next to the commode in the bathroom just off the kitchen. Fortunately, only the help used that, so Anthony was not subject to a scolding for abandoning garden implements in inappropriate places. If Anthony had been involved in Fergal's disappearance, it was likely as not he'd simply mislaid the gnome, and a thorough search would turn up the missing ornament. "How do you know Anthony broke Fergal?" I asked Mrs. Bamberger. "I just know he did," the old woman insisted. "He must have buried the pieces somewhere. He broke Fergal and was too afraid to tell me. If, and it was a big if, Anthony had really inadvertently broken the garden gnome in pieces, he probably would have feared telling his employer. In fact, the poor man looked on the verge of tears. Unfortunately, Mrs. Bamberger was not moved by tears. She viewed tears as an unforgivable sign of weakness and irrefutable evidence of a profound lack of moral fiber. "I have half a mind to fire you, Anthony," said Mrs. Bamberger. "Don't you think that's a trifle premature?" I said. "Couldn't it just as well have been someone else involved in Fergal's disappearance?" "If it wasn't Anthony, then who was it?" She had me there. I came within a toucher of saying, "Without a body, how can we know that Fergal was murdered?" Silly of me, I know, but Mrs. Bamberger was speaking of the garden gnome as if he were a living, breathing creature. "Without a what?" Mrs. Bamberger demanded. "Speak up, Ruth. You know I can't stand mumbling." I hadn't been mumbling. Mrs. Bamberger was half deaf, but she refused to admit it. Instead, she insisted we all had taken to speaking with absurdly low voices. "Without even knowing if Fergal was broken or stolen, is it really wise to accuse anyone without evidence?" I said in a loud, clear voice. "Who would have wanted to steal Fergal?" Mrs. Bamberger said, very nearly admitting that Fergal was so tasteless that no one else would want him. "I don't know," I said, "but perhaps you would allow me to look into the matter before you do anything so rash as to get rid of a perfectly good gardener." Mrs. Bamberger grudgingly agreed, but she set a time limit on my investigation. "You have until the day after Christmas," she said. "If you haven't delivered the culprit to my door by then, I'll not hesitate." "I understand," I said, and practically pushed Anthony ahead of me out of the sitting room. After that, I took Anthony down to the kitchen and fed him gingerbread until he was sufficiently calm to answer my questions. "You didn't really do it, did you?" I asked after he'd polished off 3 big hunks of gingerbread, a tall glass of milk, and a mug of hot-spiced cider into which I'd added a tipple of cooking sherry to loosen his tongue. "You can tell me if you did. I swear I won't tell Mrs. Bamberger, but I can help you better if I know the truth." "I didn't break Fergal," Anthony insisted. "I swear on my mother's grave." "Your mother isn't dead," I pointed out. "Well, I'd swear on her grave if she was." I decided to believe him. "When did you last see Fergal?" I asked. "I know he was fine and well yesterday afternoon," Anthony said. "I was trimming a dead limb off that oak in the front yard. You know the one over by the wishing well? Mrs. Bamberger may have had one of the largest, stateliest homes in town, but in her case, wealth did not confer good taste. She decorated the outside of the house as lavishly as the inside, and gnomes in particular were her weakness. Fergal had at least a dozen friends, although based on Mrs. Bamberger's reaction to his disappearance, the little fellow must have been her favorite. When it came to dealing with the care and maintenance of the 3 acres surrounding Mrs. Bamberger's house, a great deal of the gardener's labor involved moving ornaments from one place to another when there was any actual work to be done. "Where did you put Fergal after you moved him out from under the oak?" I asked Anthony. "That's the problem. I don't rightly remember." This did not surprise me. Anthony was an amiable but wooden-headed young man. "Perhaps the first thing to be done is to mount a vigorous search for the gnome," I suggested. "Flora and I will help." Flora grudgingly joined in, and for 2 full hours we endured the cold as we scoured the grounds and the outbuildings for any sign of Fergal. Fortunately, there was not yet snow, although based on the look of the sky, I feared that soon the ground would be covered with a blanket of white. "I don't think that gnome is here," said Flora as she blew on her hands in an attempt to restore feeling to her fingers. "I'm afraid I must agree with you," I said. "It's useless to continue looking any longer. Unless Fergal really was buried underground, someone had removed the gnome from the property. Whether he'd been stolen intact or taken away in pieces was a question impossible to answer." "Were there any visitors yesterday or this morning?" I asked. "Only Reverend Foster yesterday afternoon as usual," said Flora, "and I hardly think he'd steal a garden gnome. There's that grandson of Mrs. Bamberger's," Anthony pointed out. Herbert wasn't the sort of visitor I'd had in mind when I'd asked the question, but he could not be ruled out as a suspect. True, Herbert mostly kept to the house, but if he'd inadvertently damaged Fergal somehow, he'd have hardly been likely to go straight to his grandmother and confess to the crime. "Any deliveries this morning or yesterday?" I asked. "Just Ricky bringing the milk," said Flora. "It could have been a trespasser," Anthony said. It could have been, although who'd have any interest in a garish garden gnome was a mystery. "There have been some kids hanging around here lately," said Anthony. "I've had to chase them off 3 times already." This seemed a more promising possibility. "Whose kids are they?" I asked Anthony. "I think they belong to the Montgomery family down at the end of the lane." Half an hour later, armed with one of the dozen fruitcakes I'd baked that morning, I headed down the lane to pay a call on Mrs. Montgomery. The Montgomerys' residence was considerably more modest than the Bamberger house, although still perfectly respectable. I paused on the front doorstep before I rang the bell and listened to the hubbub within. Several childish voices were singing Christmas carols, only they'd not been in agreement on which carol they were singing, so the effect was similar to winding up a room full of music boxes and allowing them all to play at the same time. When I rang the bell, the singing stopped and an argument broke out about whose turn it was to answer the door. No agreement having been reached, they all came. A small boy of 8 or so with bright red hair and a sprinkling of freckles flung open the door and greeted me with a grin and a "Hello, ma'am." "Is your mother home?" I asked. The boy said yes, but a second red-haired child said she wasn't, and another argument ensued regarding the location of their mother. After this went on for a full 3 minutes while I stood out on the doorstep balancing my fruitcake, an older girl who looked to be in her early 20s intervened. She shushed the children, extended her hand, and said, "I'm Lavinia Montgomery." Lavinia, who turned out to be the oldest of the Montgomery offspring, informed me that their mother was out doing some last-minute Christmas shopping, but that she would return shortly, and would I be so kind as to await her return? I said I would. Lavinia showed me into a sitting room strewn with toys and prevented one of her younger siblings from entertaining me by banging away at the out-of-tune piano in the corner. She directed Ernest, the lad who'd opened the door, to take away my coat. When Lavinia excused herself to go to the kitchen to fetch me a cup of tea, she told the children to go upstairs and play quietly and not to bother the guest. But they didn't listen. The second their older sibling was gone, the entire Montgomery clan circled around me and waited to see what I'd do. It felt rather like being a monkey in a zoo. I'd intended to interview Mrs. Montgomery about the possibility that one of her brood might have snitched Fergal-the-garden-gnome, but now, with all of my most likely suspects staring back at me, I decided to go straight to the source. "I hear you've been playing in Mrs. Bamberger's garden," I said. "We haven't been playing in her garden," said a solemn girl of 6. "It's not allowed." "We did last week," said Ernest. "But," That was before the mean man with the cap chased us off with a rake. I'd been intending to appeal to the children's better natures by telling them that a man's livelihood was on the line if they didn't fess up to having done something with Mrs. Bamberger's gnome. But this revelation that Anthony had resorted to coming after them with a rake changed my mind. It's hard to work up a great deal of sympathy for someone who's threatened you with a garden implement, although I suspected that the threat Anthony posed to their safety was greatly exaggerated. "Do you have any favorite toys?" I asked. I got an answer from all 6 assembled children, none of which I could hear clearly because they were all talking at once. I raised my hand for silence. "Did you know grown-ups have things that are precious to them, too?" Again, there was a cacophony of voices. "Well, my employer, Mrs. Bamberger, has had something precious of hers go missing," I said. "Ernest, will you go and get the piece of paper out of my coat pocket?" When Ernest returned with a hand-colored sketch of what Fergal looked like, to the best of my recollection anyway, the children crowded around to see it. "What is that?" Ernest asked. "It's a gnome," I said. "His name is Fergal, and Mrs. Bamberger is very attached to him." "What's a gnome?" One of the youngest, who had a runny nose and kept sniffing loudly, asked. "I think it's some kind of turtle," said Ernest. Another child posited that a gnome must be something like a pumpkin. I confess that my artistic skills might be lacking, but the next time Mrs. Bamberger started going on about what was wrong with this modern generation, I anticipated being sorely tempted to add my 2 cents about the younger set's appalling lack of fairy tale knowledge. "No," said Ernest as he took a closer look at my drawing. "I think a gnome must be like a shepherd." "A shepherd?" I asked. "Like the ones down at the Methodist church." I was quite sure what Ernest meant was Methodist church. I myself took another look at the sketch. I could see how a young child might find a resemblance between Fergal, the plaster of Paris garden gnome, and one of the 2 waist-high cast concrete shepherds that were part of the annual nativity display in front of the Methodist church. Like the shepherds, Fergal had long gray hair and a long gray beard, although Fergal's was braided. And although Fergal wore a red-peaked cap that obscured his eyes instead of the flowing head coverings of the shepherds, there were definitely similarities. I was about to ask the children if any of them had seen Fergal in the flesh, but then Lavinia arrived with my cup of tea and shooed the children out. A few minutes after, Mrs. Montgomery arrived, and I presented my fruitcake and festive good wishes. "You have such pretty children," I told Mrs. Montgomery. "Such beautiful red hair they all have." I left without having brought up the disappearance of Fergal with the lady of the house. If one of the children had had anything to do with Fergal going missing, Mrs. Montgomery was unlikely to know. If she were a good parent, which despite the amiable disorder of the household I suspected she was, any whiff of theft or destruction of property would have resulted in the offending child standing on Mrs. Bamberger's doorstep and offering up their apology. I could not rule out that one or several of the Montgomery children had not had something to do with Fergal's disappearance, but I had 2 more suspects to interview, so I got right down to it. It was nearly lunchtime, and after I'd taken up soup and a sandwich to Mrs. Bamberger on a tray, I went back down to the kitchen to serve up a similar meal to her grandson, Herbert. Herbert, unlike his grandmother, who wouldn't think of breaking bread with the help, preferred to eat his midday meal with us in the kitchen. Flora and Anthony had already finished eating by the time Herbert wandered down in search of sustenance, but I let the boy finish his soup before I tackled the subject of the missing garden gnome. When I laid down the sketch of Fergal on the table and asked Herbert if it looked familiar, he pleaded complete ignorance. Unlike the Montgomery children, he recognized the creature as being a gnome, but aside from commenting that there were a number of them scattered around the grounds, he admitted to no familiarity with Fergal in particular. "Your grandmother is convinced that Anthony smashed Fergal to bits and buried the remains, and now she's threatening to fire him. I talked your grandmother out of it for the moment, but I fear that if I don't get to the bottom of the matter soon, Anthony will end up out of a job just in time for Christmas." Herbert made suitably sympathetic noises regarding the poor man's plight, but he offered up no confession nor any useful theories about what might have happened to Fergal. "Well, keep your eyes and ears open," I told Herbert as I ladled out a second bowl of potato soup. "You might discover something. I asked the neighbor children about it, and they seemed to think Fergal-the-gnome strongly resembled the shepherds from the Methodist Church nativity display. Herbert said he had not seen the Methodist Church nativity display, but expressed doubt that a garden gnome named Fergal could pass for one of the shepherds. "Well, you'll have a chance to see it Christmas Eve," I told Herbert. "Your grandmother wouldn't think of missing the Christmas Eve service, and she'll expect you to accompany her." Mrs. Bamberger expected us all to accompany her. No matter what plans we might have made with our loved ones, Mrs. Bamberger insisted that everyone in her employ be present and correct and sitting up straight in a hard church pew on Christmas Eve to make up for in advance any of the festive excesses we might partake in on the day itself. I didn't mind going. I rather enjoyed the service, but Herbert balked at the idea. "There's no use protesting," I told him. "You'll be expected to attend, so you might as well make the best of it. It's quite lovely, really." Herbert didn't come right out and say that just because I, a cook-housekeeper of late middle age, might find something lovely, he would also, but his face fell. "Well, try applying some of that knowledge you've gleaned from reading all those spy novels to discovering what's happened to Fergal," I told him. Herbert didn't seem to think there was much overlap between international espionage and tracking down missing lawn statuary, but I begged to differ. Someone knew what had happened to Fergal, and I intended to find out who that person was. My only remaining suspect was Ricky, the milkman, for the sole reason that he was known to have been on the property during the time period when Fergal had gone missing, but that interview had to wait until in the morning when Ricky made his rounds. Christmas Eve dawned clear and bright. Right before Ricky generally arrived with our usual 3 pints of milk and a bottle of cream, I sent Flora off on an urgent errand. Normally, she would have balked at missing the chance to see her boyfriend, but not after the traumatic dousing they'd received from Mrs. Bamberger the previous day. When I heard the milk truck pull up outside, I was Johnny on the spot and managed to fling open the door just as Ricky was depositing the bottles on the doorstep. "Won't you come in for some gingerbread and a cup of coffee?" Ricky hesitated. "Mrs. Bamberger fell back asleep after breakfast," I told him. "Is Flora here?" "No, I sent her out on an errand," I said. "I want a word with you." Ricky came in and sat down at the small table under the window. When I brought him a hunk of gingerbread and a steaming cup of coffee, he said, "Flora isn't in trouble, is she?" "Not that I know of. Should she be?" No, Ricky said hastily. "I was just worried." "Why were you worried? I'm sure you know what happened yesterday." "Mrs. Bamberger caught you and Flora kissing and threw a basin full of water on your head. Is there something more I should know?" Ricky hesitated. "Does this have something to do with a garden gnome?" I asked. Ricky was a simple soul, and even though he protested that his apprehension had nothing to do with any garden gnomes, I did not believe him. The truth was written all over his face. "You'd better be honest with me," I said. "I have no desire to see anyone fired, but if somebody doesn't either come clean about destroying Fergal or return him to the loving embrace of Mrs. Bamberger intact, one of us is going to be jobless come Christmas Day." "I don't know what happened to that garden gnome," said Ricky. "I swear I don't. I had him wrapped up safe and sound in a gunny sack in the back of my milk truck, but somewhere between Elm Street and Claremont Avenue, he disappeared." "And how exactly did Fergal end up wrapped in a gunny sack in the back of your milk truck?" "I intended to return him," said Ricky. "I didn't want to get Flora in trouble, you see." "I'm afraid I don't see," I said. "Why should Flora get into trouble?" "I thought Mrs. Bamberger would blame Flora," Ricky said. "You thought Mrs. Bamberger would blame Flora for stealing Fergal-the-garden-gnome." I could have sworn that the previous day when Flora had helped Anthony and I make a thorough search of the grounds for the missing piece of statuary that she'd really had no idea where the gnome was, but perhaps I'd been hoodwinked. "Flora didn't steal that gnome," said Ricky. "She doesn't even know I broke it." "You broke Fergal?" "It was just a minor break. When I tripped over him, one of his little hands got lopped off. It was a nice, neat break, and I thought with a little glue, he'd be as good as new." "How did you come to be tripping over Fergal?" I asked. "He was sitting at the bottom of the doorstep," said Ricky, "and when I tried to dodge the water Mrs. Bamberger threw on us, I must have knocked him over." It would have been perfectly in character for Anthony to have abandoned Fergal at the bottom of the doorstep, and then to have forgotten all about having done so. It was also entirely believable that Ricky would have knocked Fergal over and broken him while dodging the deluge from Mrs. Bamberger's wash basin. The big question was, where was Fergal now? Who would have stolen a bit of damaged lawn statuary out of the back of a milk truck? Is it possible that the gnome might have simply fallen out the back of the truck? I asked Ricky. That's the first question I asked myself. As soon as I discovered that the gnome was missing, I went back over the entire route. But he'd vanished. It seemed obvious to me that some kind soul had rescued poor, injured Fergal from the roadway, and that there was nothing to do but go door to door and inquire at every house from Elm Street over to Claremont Avenue until Fergal was found. But I hadn't the time. I had the finishing touches to put on Mrs. Bamberger and Herbert's Christmas dinner before I went home at noon to prepare my own feast for my daughters, sons-in-law, and 14 grandchildren, who'd all be sitting around our own table come Christmas Day. I needed reinforcements. By mid-morning, I'd finished the cooking and laid the table with Mrs. Bamberger's best china and sent Flora and Anthony home early. On the way to my house, I stopped off at the Montgomerys and asked for Lavinia. I explained the situation as best I could and asked if she'd be willing to organize her younger siblings into a search party to canvass the neighborhood for the missing gnome. I pressed a bag of dimes into her hand to reward her young search party for their efforts. "What shall we do if we find it?" Lavinia asked. "Shall we take the gnome straight back to Mrs. Bamberger?" I feared that anyone returning Fergal, especially if the gnome were visibly damaged, would wilt under questioning, and the guilty parties, of which there were several, would eventually be exposed. "No," I said. "Repair Fergal the best you can and then leave him at this location." I handed Lavinia a piece of paper with written instructions. She read them, then gave me a quizzical look. "Are you sure?" she said. "Absolutely. Shall I telephone you if we find the gnome?" "No," I said. "I shall simply hope for a Christmas miracle." I didn't entirely leave the outcome of Fergal's safe return up to divine intervention, however. Before I went home, I stopped off to see Reverend Foster at the vicarage. After explaining my predicament, I presented the Reverend with a fruitcake, my season's greetings, a bit of old muslin, and a short length of rope. "I'm relying on you," I told the Reverend. "A good man's livelihood hangs in the balance." A good man's livelihood also depended on the resource of a passel of red-headed youngsters, but as I could do no more than I already had, I turned my attention to the preparation of the Christmas turkey and the making of half a dozen pies. At 6:45 that evening, the preparations of our Christmas feast complete, my husband and I set out on foot for the Christmas Eve service at the Methodist church. It was crisp and cold, and snow had begun to fall. As we neared the church, I could see a crowd gathered around the Nativity outside, and we paused to join them. The infant Christ lay in his cast concrete manger, watched over by an adoring concrete Mary and Joseph. The 3 wise men stood to the side at a respectful distance, bearing their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. A concrete cow and a trio of concrete sheep looked on. I gave all these a perfunctory glance, but what I was really interested in were the shepherds. True to tradition, 2 shepherds hovered off to one side with the trio of sheep. One of the shepherds was the same as always, but his compatriot, contrary to years past, was a bit shorter and squatter than the usual version. If one looked closely under his muslin head covering, it was clear that this shepherd's beard was done in a rather unusual style for biblical times. Shepherd number 2 wore his beard in a braid. "You go on inside," I told my husband, "and find us a seat. I'm going to wait for Mrs. Bamberger to arrive." When Mrs. Bamberger climbed the steps to the church and took Reverend Foster's hand, I heard him say, "We are deeply grateful to you for the loan of your statuary. I never cease to wonder at your generous spirit." "My what?" Mrs. Bamberger said. "Your gnome turned out to be the perfect stand-in for our missing shepherd," Reverend Foster said. "It was so thoughtful of you to send it over at the last minute." "My what?" Mrs. Bamberger repeated, and then came back down the steps to see for herself. "Well, I never," I heard her say. "I think that's Fergal," I said, sidling up and pointing to the short, squat shepherd lingering at the back of the tableau. "I can see that," said Mrs. Bamberger, a bit testily but under her breath so the Reverend couldn't hear her. How did he get there? It must be a Christmas miracle, I said. Humph! Surely you wouldn't think of firing Anthony when Fergal is not only safe and sound, but also an honorary guardian of the Holy Family. Humph! Shall we go inside? I said. I think I can hear the choir. My husband and I sat 2 pews behind the Montgomerys. In the pause between Silent Night and Oh, Come All Ye Faithful, Ernest Montgomery craned his head around and spotted me. He winked at me, dug into the breast pocket of his little tweed jacket, held up a dime, and gave me a big grin. Behind me, I could hear Anthony singing off-key, his voice blending with the childish voices of his 6 hungry little mouths to feed. Oh, come all ye faithful. Joyful and triumphant, I couldn't stop smiling. It was indeed a Christmas miracle. The end.